The Cronarch Institute on Station Elumir had been training temporal navigators for 210 years. Its admission rate was 2%, the lowest of any assembly program, because a bad crossing did not simply fail, it unwrote things. A drift relay pilot who miscalculated a return window did not crash. They arrived somewhere they had never left, or failed to arrive at all, or worse, arrived twice. Every stable relay corridor in assembly space had been mapped by someone who sat in these lecture halls first, memorizing the same causality proofs, under the same recessed lighting. The Institute measured its own history the way it measured everything else, against a fixed reference frame. 210 years of continuous operation, 44 graduating classes, a registry of 9,000 confirmed relay corridors, each one certified by no fewer than 4 independent chronometric stations before a single ship was permitted to use it. The Institute did not deal in approximation. It dealt in invariance. Every cadet learned the same founding case in their first week. The Havorson fracture, 130 years prior, when an uncertified pilot had attempted a shortcut through an unmapped drift corridor and had arrived at his destination 4 days before departing from his origin. The paradox had not resolved cleanly. It had resolved messily, publicly, and had cost the assembly 11 ships trying to contain the resulting inconsistency before the timeline settled. The Institute's entire culture, the quadruple-locked verification, the refusal to certify a corridor on a single reading, the 6-month waiting period before any new route was cleared for cadet use, traced back to that one fracture. New cadets watched the containment records in orientation before they were shown anything else. In 210 years, 14 humans had been admitted to the program. 4 had graduated. Human temporal perception, the admissions literature noted with a kind of institutional politeness, was considered functional but imprecise for fine-grained drift calibration. A polite way of saying that human instincts tended to round a crossing to the nearest second, when the mathematics required precision to the nearest millisecond. The kind of error margin that could compound across a long relay into something unrecoverable. The current class had won. Ren Calder was 27 years old, out of the Frontier Temporal Corps, and had applied to the Institute with a service record that Director Sale Corrin read twice. The first read produced a timestamp that did not match its own departure log. An arrival entry dated 11 minutes before the corresponding departure entry, a discrepancy so small that Corrin's initial assumption was clerical error, a dropped decimal, a clock drifting out of sync with itself. The verification request went to 4 separate relay stations along the corridor Ren had used, none of which knew the others had been asked. All 4 came back confirmed. The arrival timestamp was real. The departure timestamp was real. The instrument logs showed no signs of tampering, no signs of clock failure, nothing that could explain the 11 minutes except that the 11 minutes were, according to every law the Institute had ever certified, not supposed to be able to exist. Corrin ran the verification a 5th time personally, alone, after the 4 stations reported back, because 26 years directing the admissions board had taught her that some numbers needed to survive elimination before they could be trusted. The 5th run matched the first 4. Ren had not mentioned any of it in her interview. She had answered questions about relay theory and drift calibration in the same even register she used for everything else, and when Corrin had asked, almost as an afterthought, whether her service record contained anything unusual, Ren had said that she'd flown a few corridors that ran long. She arrived at the station on a supply hauler 2 days before orientation, found her assigned berth, and unpacked a courier's field kit that still carried the faint ozone smell of a drift field that never fully aired out of insulated canvas. She did not introduce herself to her cohort beyond what was required. She had the certification proofs read a full week before lectures began, and by the 2nd week, she had a reputation among her cohort not for being remarkable, but for being unremarkable in a way that made a few of them start paying closer attention. The challenge came during a 3rd-year seminar on relay corridor certification, 5 weeks into the term, in front of the full cohort of 9 cadets. The seminar had been discussing the outer limits of chronometric confidence, how fine a margin could be trusted before the instruments themselves became the source of the error. Cadet Ilan Vaskar, Thren, 3rd year, ranked 1st in chronodynamics for 6 consecutive terms, had a habit of steering seminar discussion toward whatever made her own precision look sharpest. This was not considered a flaw by her instructors. It was considered rigor, and rigor was rewarded at the institute the same way certified corridors were rewarded, with rank. What the cohort did not know, and what only came out afterward, was that Vaskar had spent 3 evenings that week quietly cross-referencing public Frontier Corps route manifests, trying to reconstruct which relays Wren might have flown before admission. She found nothing conclusive. Courier assignments were sparse in the public record. But she found enough irregularities in the timing data to convince herself there was a discrepancy worth surfacing in front of an audience. She did not consider this unfair. She considered it verification, the same discipline the Institute asked of every certified number. She introduced the question the way that certain cadets introduce questions, which is to say with the timing and tone of someone who has prepared it, who has been waiting through several minutes of unrelated discussion for precisely the right gap to open. So the question can arrive as though it were spontaneous. So, Vaskar said, turning slightly in her seat, not quite looking at Wren, but positioned so the whole room could see she was addressing her. "What's the earliest you've ever arrived somewhere, Calder?" Several cadets smiled. It was a specific category of smile, the kind that happens in rooms where an informal hierarchy is being quietly reconfirmed rather than challenged. Nobody in the room believed the human courier pilot was about to say anything that would trouble the seminar's usual order. Vaskar's question was not cruel. It was the natural behavior of someone who had never had her own precision meaningfully tested, and who did not expect this to be the day it started. Director Corin, seated at the back of the room, said nothing. She had pulled Wren's chronometric files in the second week of the term. She had read the 4 station confirmations 3 times each. She had run her own 5th verification alone, at night, in an empty office, and had told no one. She had been waiting since then for a discussion topic that would let the question arrive on its own, without her having to manufacture the moment herself. "That's a reasonable question," Wren said, in the tone of someone who genuinely found it reasonable, without a trace of the awareness the room expected. No defensiveness, no irony, no sense that she understood herself to be at the center of anything. "Do you want the certified answer, or the actual one?" Vaskar's smile widened by a fraction, the expression of someone who has just been handed a better version of the setup than she'd planned for. "The actual one." Wren gave her a relay designation, a string of coordinates that meant nothing to most of the cohort on first hearing, and a time offset, stated quietly and without any drama in her voice, of 11 minutes before her own departure. The room went quiet the way a held breath goes quiet. Nobody moved to fill the silence. Vaskar's smile stayed on her face for another 2 seconds, the way an expression sometimes outlasts the reason for it. Director Corin stood and opened the console at the front of the room. "Since the second week," she said, "I've had this queued and ready. I was waiting for the right question to arrive." The feed she put on the main display was not dramatic in the way that Institute training simulations were dramatic. Simulations had a particular polish to them, a smoothed, rendered quality every cadet in the room could recognize within half a second of looking at it. This was raw chronometric telemetry, unedited, time-stamped by instruments that recorded in absolute reference frame time regardless of who was watching. The first data point showed Wren's courier ship, 3 years prior, entering the bellwether relay at a departure station. A routine crossing log, nothing unusual in the framing until the timestamp block resolved and the room could see the entry mark itself, ordinary in every way except for the number attached to it. Nobody spoke. The second data point showed the arrival log at the far end of the same relay, from an independent station that had no communication with the departure station at the time of recording, time-stamped 11 minutes before the departure entry the room had just seen. Corin let the 2 timestamps sit side by side on the screen a moment longer than necessary, long enough for a few cadets to start working through the arithmetic themselves. The third data point was a cross-confirmation from a second independent station along the corridor, run without knowledge of the first 2. Arriving at a timing offset within the margin, the Institute considered acceptable for certified readings. One of the cadets near the back, a Thren third year named Ossel, who rarely spoke in seminar, said quietly, "That corridor isn't certified for anything under 15 minutes of drift tolerance," to no one, and nobody answered him. The fourth was a formal review notation, dated and signed. "Anomalous, within instrument confidence, pending further study." Corin noted almost as an aside that the review board's internal comments on the notation described it as the tightest verified drift anomaly the board had processed in over 60 years, and that it had been sitting in a study queue since the year it was filed. By the time Corin brought up the fifth data point, a fourth independent confirmation, requested specifically because the review board had refused to close the file on 3 readings alone, Vaskar was no longer smiling. She was watching the display with the expression of someone running a calculation that was clearly going to outlast the seminar period. Her jaw had not moved. Her eyes had not moved either, except to track the timestamps scrolling past. Nobody in the cohort spoke through any of it. The silence held through the 4th data point and through the 5th and settled into something closer to stillness than quiet. The specific kind of stillness that happens when 9 people are simultaneously deciding not to be the first one to say anything. Corin let the 5th data point sit on the screen a full minute before she closed the feed. She did not summarize it. She did not explain what it meant for the Institute's own certification thresholds. She simply closed the console, the way a person closes a door on a room they intend to come back to. The seminar ended without anyone assigning next week's proofs, which was itself unusual enough that a few cadets exchanged glances on their way out. Vaskar was among the last to gather her materials. She stood when the room had mostly emptied, packed her data slate with the same precision she brought to everything, and stopped at the door on her way out. "The tolerance thresholds are going to need revising," she said, not quite turning to look back at the room. A thought finishing itself out loud, addressed to no one in particular rather than an admission made directly to Wren. It was not an apology, and it was not meant to be one. It was a person recalibrating in real time, out loud, because the alternative was carrying the miscalibration silently, and she did not seem built for that. She paused another moment at the threshold, one hand on the doorframe. "I spent 3 evenings this week trying to find a hole in your service record," she said, still not turning around. "I didn't find one. I should have looked for a hole in the tolerance model instead." Then she left, and the door closed behind her without any further sound. Wren packed her field kit, the same one that still carried the faint ozone smell of drift residue, and said nothing in response to any of it. She had not spoken since giving the timestamp. She did not seem to feel she had anything left to add. Corin waited until the room had emptied entirely before she spoke again. "Since week 2, she said, "I've been waiting for someone to ask you the right question. I could have brought the footage to a lecture myself. It wouldn't have landed the same way." Wren nodded once. "I wasn't trying to make it land any particular way." "I know," Corin said. "That's why it did." There was a pause, brief and unremarkable, the kind that happens between 2 people who have said what they came to say. "The review board is going to want a formal debrief," Corin added. "Not tonight, next week probably, take a few days first." "All right," Wren said. She picked up the field kit and walked out without anything further to say. Corin sat back down at the console once the room was empty, and for a while she did not write anything. She pulled the 5 data points back up on the display, one at a time, and looked at each of them again in the quiet of the room, not because she doubted them, but because 26 years in the role had taught her that the moments worth remembering were the ones that happened right after everyone else had left. She closed the feed a second time. She opened the cohort's assessment log, found Wren Calder's name near the bottom of the list, and against it wrote 2 words.